And for a lot of the people listening now, a lot of people may be new to this whole gender issue. I know when I started researching it, it was a steep learning curve because to me it was
Yeah.
like gender, sex, boy, girl, like how complicated this is X, Y, X, X, why is this so? But then I started looking into it and it's like, okay, there's intersex, non-binary, transmasculine, two-spirit, gender non-conforming, gender neutral, gender this. And I was like, whoa,
Yeah.
like how am I, and I think maybe it would help if you could give the listeners a bit of a history lesson on the word gender itself and the etymology of that, of just the evolution in a sense of the
Yeah.
word gender, because it isn't where it used to be 20 years ago,
Yeah.
50 years ago, 100 years ago. So maybe give us just a little cliff note version of like what the word means today versus historically what it's meant.
Yeah. So I guess I'll go historical and then we'll talk about what it means today. So looking back, the word gender itself comes from a root that's like thousands of years old, gin, which you think about, the different words engender, generations, generate. These different words that are connected with it tell us about what the origin is. So the origin of the meaning is giving birth, procreation, and also family or tribe. So that's kind of the core of it. And for me, knowing that is really important because at the root of gender and what we now know or has been described as the binary system is not some plan to oppress women. And it's not some plan to somehow, like forcibly get people into boxes. It is the response to a primordial, essential human experience, which is to share in the mystery of bringing new life into the world. And there's only two ways to do it. You're either a mother or you're a father. You're a woman or you're a man. So at the root of gender and this binary expression of it as male and female is this human experience. So the word over time, we're going to do huge flash forwards, the cliff notes. It shows up in English, in Middle English in the 14th, 15th century. Mostly, like you said on that show before, grammar related. With the whole scientific revolution, it becomes more connected with biology, anatomy. But in the 20th century is really when the shift happens to get into what we would refer to as kind of a modern definition. Mid 20th century, there's a guy, Dr. John Money, who's studying hermaphrodites, is what they would have been referred to at the time. Now it would be referred to as intersex. And his research with children leads him to publish a document in which he defines gender as the social characteristics, behaviors, and expectations associated with being a male or a female. And he, in fact, says that that's not something that's locked in at birth, but it's fluid up to 2 years. So mid 20th century, here's a scientist who publishes this article, and he's saying, I've got this research, and this backs it up. So gender at that point moves from before what had been connected with being a man or a woman, the gender sex synonymous meaning, to become something in which it's separate from sex. Sex is biology, and gender is social construct. And this is something that is not just in his world of science, but becomes sort of this explosive force in the culture with both sexual revolution and what's called second wave feminism, which is basically the feminism that rises up in the 60s and the 70s. And they're really, really harping on this new definition of gender because it gives a language to try and express how they feel that they've been mistreated or boxed in by culture, these expectations of gender roles and stereotypes, etc. So 60s and 70s, gender becomes known for, again, something separate from sex that has to do with a social construct. Now, John Money also continues his work and comes up with a further differentiation. And he says there's something called gender identity and a gender role. So now all of a sudden you've got this thing out there in the culture, which is social norm that constructs gender. And then now I have gender identity, which is how I feel about those norms inside. And so my sense of being a woman or being a man is something subjective, it's interior, it's my feelings, it's my emotions. And so that continues into the late 20th century when all of a sudden this movement to begin to introduce a new idea and understanding of gender arises. It's known as gender ideology. It's something that grew up earlier than that, but really gets named this by the church in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s. And again, this is an attempt not to merely fight for equality and justice for men and women. It's actually an attempt to eradicate differences between men and women, and to say that there's actually this fluid spectrum. You hear about that, the gender spectrum. You mentioned some crazy different sort of like, names and labels and things that are out there. And this is kind of coming out of this progression. So John Money is important because he gives a scientific basis for what the feminists will create in their sort of social movement. And then later on in sort of international policy, especially the UN and the like, in different governments, you're going to see it become law as well. And this movement has advanced to where we're at today, in which case now certain countries to not use a preferred pronoun is criminal, or in certain places to even, one country, the craziest law I've heard of, they were wanting to outlaw, I can't remember if it was Sweden, it was they wanted to outlaw men being able to have urinals because it was unequal. Yeah.
Well, just give the women them,
Yeah.
Are we
Yeah.
even? Yeah.
Anyhow, so I mean, just that because you get stuck in the ideology, and what is ideology? It's my idea becomes more important than reality. And so anything that conflicts with the idea I have of what should be is going to be decimated. It's going to be changed through science and technology, through hormones, through surgery, through law and public policy. So that's a little bit of the history, kind of where we're at today, and the landscape that we're looking at when we hear this conversation about gender in sort of the public sphere.